Okay, so now we are at the more technical part of the artwork here, and we are going to start to blend this subject into this backdrop here. So this process, there's no definitive way to do it precisely because it's a highly subjective and creative process, and there's so many different ways you can approach it. But today, I'm just going to use the minimum necessary requirements to get this subject here blended into the backdrop, and I'm just going to talk through some of the principles and ideas around placing a subject into a background, and we're going to blend the lighting and the colors and then refine the edges. So the process will be, we're going to adjust the lighting on the subject. We are then going to adjust the colors. We're then going to add some shadow, and then we are going to refine the edges. So that's basically the process. And once we've done that, we should have a pretty good result, and hopefully you will have learned some techniques and some of the ideas around this process. So to get started, we have our folder here, our group, sorry, with our subject. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a adjustment layer, which is a hue saturation adjustment layer. And I'm just going to I'm going to add this to the top here of the layers that are clipped on here to the subject layer. I'm just going to hold Alt and just make sure I'm clipping that adjustment layer to the subject. And I'm also going to add, if I click on the adjustment layer icon, I'm just also going to add a curves adjustment layer on top of the hue saturation. So you'll see why shortly. I'm adding these two to begin with. So we go hue saturation and then a curves adjustment. So the curves adjustment is to make changes to the values, which is the lighting on the subject, as well as each of the color channels, red, green, and blue. We can also adjust the color. We're just going to stay with RGB here. So we are just adjusting the brightness and darkness on the subject. So I won't talk too deeply about curves. There's different adjustment layers you can use, but today I'm just going to demonstrate curves because it's a very flexible adjustment layer to adjusting lighting on a subject. So the first thing I'm concentrating on at this point, because we can continuously improve and make changes throughout the process depending on what we need to do. And what I mean by that is we can start with one adjustment layer and get like a base adjustment on the subject, and then we can add more adjustment layers to refine the lighting if we need to. So we're not going to stress too much about getting it perfect because we can refine it afterwards. And we may reach a decent enough result in a short time. So we will see how we go. So I have my curves adjustment layer here, and so with the curves adjustment here, you've got this line which runs from the bottom left to the top right, and it's basically a line that represents the values in the entire image. So you'll see this like graph here. This is called, I think it's a histogram. Hopefully I have that correct. And if I move this, you'll see if I move the bottom left, I'm making adjustments to, like, I'm brightening the shadows, and if I move to the right, I'm actually darkening the shadows. So we're moving from the shadows to the mid-tones to the highlights in the image. So if I grab the top right here and move to the left, you'll see I'm actually adjusting the overall brightness of the highlights. And if I do the same by bringing the top highlights to the top of the curves line here down, we're actually making the highlights darker. So that's kind of the spectrum here. So the first thing I want to do is I want to just get a nice base level of light on the subject that matches the background well enough. So I'm going to start by putting a point here on the line by just left clicking, and this will enable us to get some control on the shadows. So if I just grab this little line here and we just start to move to the right here, you'll see we're starting to make some darker contrasts occur in the shadows on the baby here. So I'm just going to move over to the right to a point where I feel like we are in the correct range based on the lighting in the background. So just to make things a little bit clearer, when compositing or putting a subject into a scene, we just want to bear in mind and reference the darkest areas in the background and the brightest areas in the background. Our job is to basically make sure the darkest areas on the subject that we're putting in match relatively well enough the darkest areas on the background. And same for the highlights. We want to make sure that the highlights on the subject match the highlights in the background. So we don't want to have a subject that's far too dark for the background and far too bright for the background. That just wouldn't make sense. That's the best way we can determine the correct lighting. So I'm just going to move the shadow, this little point here I've put on the shadows, just going to move this over to the right. And I'm just going to move in slightly here so you can kind of see. I'm looking at one of the dark areas on the baby here, and we can see the hair here is quite dark in comparison to the kind of this faded background look we have here in the shadows. So we're not going to worry too much right now, but we're just going to keep that in mind for adjusting in a moment. So if I move the baby this way with the darkness, we can see that's probably too much. That's probably not enough. We're kind of going to sit maybe, just moving left and right here, we're just probably going to sit maybe just around here for now. So I'm just going to make some further refinements here. So maybe around there. So the next thing is I'm just going to grab the highlights and just move them down slightly, because we're going to add some more lighting in a moment. So if I just bring the highlights down maybe to around there for now, and I'm also going to add another point here so we can make some additional just refinements to the lighting on the subject here. So I'm just going to be just moving these 2 points around just to get a result that I'm happy with. Right, so I'm going to leave the points like that for the moment. I'll just see if I can just add a little bit more highlight back into the subject by moving this, but not too high. We don't want it too contrasted. Just to around there. So I'm just going to move down to the hue saturation adjustment layer, and because the reason I added this in first was because if we start making changes to the value on in the image, we start to see some saturation. We need to adjust the saturation as well. So making sure that, because generally when subjects or when images are in shadow, they're less saturated. So we just need to make sure we're kind of matching that adjustment on the shadows just on the baby here with the baby's skin color. We don't want it like too saturated. We just need to bring it down a little because we got the baby in some shadow, just like that. So the next thing I'm going to do is, once we have our base level curves adjustment, which we can refine afterwards, we're going to add we're going to adjust the colors. So before I do that, I'm just actually going to make some further refinements here. So I'm actually going to move the utmost shadow point here just up a little, because I can see we've kind of got this faded kind of look here, and I'm kind of just making sure that dark area on the baby's hair is a similar level of fade. So I'm going to just bring those shadows a little bit brighter. Oops. And just making sure, yeah, we're getting a more correct looking lighting. So if I just turn this curves off, yeah, you'll see before and after. And yeah, so we've basically just darkened the highlights and shadows here, and we've added a little bit more brightness in the shadows just to match the contrast of the shadows here on the swing. Okay, next thing we're going to do is adjust the colors. So to do that, I'm going to add a color balance adjustment layer and just clip it above the curves. And I'm just going to adjust the saturation down just a little bit more and then move back to color balance. Okay, so with color balance, this is basically kind of what I mentioned before. We can work with the shadows, midtones, and highlight colors in the image. So this is quite a handy adjustment layer because we can we've got some flexibility in adjusting the colors on the subject. So we may not need to delve into the shadows, but we are just focusing on the midtones and highlights for now and just matching those colors with the background. So like I mentioned earlier, there's a number of ways to do this, but in my experience, this is probably the most straightforward method, and it will enable you to also learn about matching subjects into a scene. So I'm just going to move the first slider here and just move it in a direction that is moving the colors in a, you can tell that that's too red and that's too much cyan. So we're kind of just finding a middle ground, probably about there. And then we move on to the next slider. So we can see the background here is actually kind of greenish. So we're just going to add some more green into the subject just to match that overall tone. Like not too much, just a little bit, just there. And then lastly, this final slider here, you can tell that's too much blue, too much, probably not too much yellow there, too much yellow. We're going to find a happy kind of area here. Just like that, I think. So if I turn that on and off already, you can see the difference in the color. And yeah, we can always refine it afterwards if we need to. So we've adjusted the midtones, and we're just going to do the same for the highlights. So this is just going to affect the brightest areas on the subject. So if we just click on highlights, and I'll just do the same. I'm just going to move it in a direction that I feel like is relatively correct. We don't need a lot here. Probably about there. Probably about there. And I can see that the highlights here are quite, if I get my eyedropper, if we use the eyedropper tool, we can actually check the color here. So if we go to a bright area, and if we check what color we've got, yeah, we can actually see we're in the green zone here with these highlights. So good practice to bear in mind when we're adjusting highlights. We can add a little bit of green in there. Just like that. And there's final highlights here. Just like that. I think that's fine. So that's pretty good for now. We could attempt to adjust the shadows, but I tend to find that the shadow adjustments on the color balance can be quite harsh. But perhaps we will do it today just to demonstrate. So with the shadows, just going to click on shadows, and I'm just going to look at the shadows here on the baby and look here and just make sure, like, we just choose an area where we can see dark, and we're just going to match. Like if I color pick over here, like here, yeah, we can see we're in the green kind of yellow zone here. So bear that in mind when you're making the adjustments. I'll add a little bit of yellow, tiny bit of yellow, tiny bit of green. Yeah, and I'll leave it at that. It's like very minimal. So I've added one green and took away one blue with that adjustment. So I'm pretty happy with that base level of lighting on the baby right now, and we will make further adjustments in the next couple of steps. So I'm just going to make a save on that. Control S, or go up to File, Save. And now we will move on to making some more lighting adjustments.